Welcome everyone across the planet to Connecting the Dots, a laser-focused quick-fire interview on food and the economy with international experts, where we seek answers to questions all of us should be asking. I'm Ajay Jakhar, Chairman Bharat Krishik Samaj of Farmers Forum India. At the John Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Professor Devesh Kapur is the Starr Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies and Director of Asia Programs. Welcome, Professor Kapur. We are delighted to have you with us. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Ajay, for having me.
Yeah. You have spent decades studying the developing economies and why most have failed to succeed, even though they had such promising prospects. Today, we would want to particularly focus on some parts of the power dynamics, particularly with reference to India. The first question would be, Professor Arvind Subramaniam and yourself have recently published a paper where you have mentioned that only 7% of those authorizing conference papers for World Bank's prestigious annual bank conference on development economics are from the developing world. The power to set the narrative in development policy and economics remains concentrated in Western institutions. What makes these power imbalances so persistent and difficult to change? Do you think this is one of the reasons why the global South remains poor while the West progresses?
So one, Ajay, is that there isn't a one-to-one correspondence between the sort of social science dominance of the West or lack of representation and development outcomes. And the very good examples are China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. They too are not strongly represented in these publications. In fact, very, very poorly. And yet we know that they have had very good development outcomes. But there's no doubt that weaker countries, the fads and fashions of elite academia in the West often get foisted on them. Often they have no choice, or they do not have a stronger ways to counteract intellectually. And say in other cases, and India is a very good example, what we've also done is weaken our own universities. And when your own institutions are weak, and frankly, they have been weakened by ourselves rather than any outside forces, then of course you do not have that intellectual heft to be, and that self-confidence to be able to counter it with your own intellectual voice and narrative.
So you think we are more responsible for our own issues that we have than anybody else?
I think if it comes to a Burkina Faso, that it's weak and there are too many external forces. But in our case, I don't think so. We can't claim we are a nuclear power and we are a rising and aspiring sort of global power. And yet on these things, somehow we put the blame elsewhere.
So the next question we would take is on the randomized controlled trials as a methodology for influencing policymaking. And these have been critiqued by Deaton and Cartwright, Gendres, and others. Your own critique has brought focus on the power imbalances and practical costs of RCTs, which lead to crowding out effects in development research, such that only elite institutions in the West can afford to conduct them. In the coming years, do you think this dominance is likely to become more entrenched, despite the pushback? And what implications does this hold for development research and policy?
Well, see, as with every good idea, there's no doubt that RCTs had a lot of promise, and there were many good things that you can do from it. So let's be very clear about that. Our critique was not about that. Our critique was more about that even good ideas have to be reined in, because there are other, especially when they begin to displace other good ideas. And, whatever you might say about the RCT folks, they could well say, well, these ideas, we are coming to you, why do you accept them? Why do you agree to run these experiments? You can always say no, right? Why don't you come up with your own counter, with your own intellectual ideas, and why don't you have them? So, in a sense, when there's a vacuum in power, whoever has some power is bound to fill that vacuum, right? So I think, but I think there is a greater consciousness that there are so many large macro shocks sweeping the world, that RCTs which are very micro, there are lots of questions that cannot be answered, they are being neglected. I think that consciousness is now much greater.
So again, you're implying that the problems are at home rather than any structures pushing us to do a particular thing from outside India.
Yeah, meaning, what I don't want to say is this either or,
Yes.
but I do think that we have to take more responsibilities for where we are and what we ought to do.
That comes us to the third question, which is post the second COVID wave, economists are predicting a fall in the Indian GDP by a third. We are a country of declining growth but rising inflation. What are the prescriptions for recovery of the Indian economy that you would suggest? When you look at the newspapers and the media and the economists, many are talking about taking the physical route involving revenue generation by a higher taxation, as suggested by President Biden in the US, or a monetary route through RBI printing more money. What would you suggest we should be doing? Because we seem to be at sea today.
Well, Ajay, this is both a very hard question, and as you know, when something of this magnitude, there are just no magic bullets here. Uh, I think the first thing clearly has to be is to manage the magnitude of the health shock. Because if people are not healthy, if they are fearful, very little will happen. People don't invest, people don't buy if they are apprehensive about the future. So, and the best way to restore their confidence is to restore health. So I think the first thing has to be, with whatever it takes, is to vaccinate the population and do it for free. Uh, You know, because since vaccination has so much externalities, we should not say it is for X or Y. Yes, you can do it by age, you can do it spatially, do it first in the zones where you have the maximum economic activity. So those are about how you pace it, how you roll it out. But as a principle, we just have to be committed. The first thing is you promise everyone will get a vaccine as soon as possible and put in whatever resources.
Yeah.
This has to be treated like a war effort. It really is of that importance. Once you have that in control, I think the other things will begin to follow more easily.
Yes. So I mean, you've given an immediate goal that needs to be done with precedes every other step that the country needs to take. And I have just one or two more questions. One is, we have seen recently that China has been reining in its biggest businesses like Tencent and Alibaba through anti-competition regulations. However, it seems India is helping create oligarchies by championing corporate interests and passing laws that allow for market consolidation by large players, and not just in agriculture. Over time, these big players become deciding arbiters of power in a nation. Democracy, capitalism, private entrepreneurship all suffer as a consequence. Do you foresee this happening in India, and do you have any examples of this, how it's happened in other parts of the world?
So, Ajay, a very good example elsewhere is South Korea. As you know, South Korea was dominated by a handful of chaebols. The Samsungs, the LG, uh, Daewoo, and so on. And they had an extraordinarily high share of Korean GDP that they had. Not India is nowhere there, and yet South Korea did very well, right? Now, I think the difference is that in Korea, the Jaibal's power was controlled by making sure that they were in tradable sectors. So the discipline on them did not necessarily come through regulation, but through competition, right? Now, I think one apprehension I have about some of the consolidation of power, which is in certain companies that we are aware of, is that their power is growing in non-tradable sectors like ports or optical fiber cable and so on. These are natural monopolies. These are not trade, they are not in the tradable sectors. So you really cannot use the pressure of international competition to make sure that they cannot raise prices, all of that stuff, right?
Okay.
And so I think that you have to be particularly strong on regulation in non-tradable sectors because you do not have the option of competition as a way to curb or at least limit their power.
That,
And that's where I think the Competition Commission of India, etc., have really not been as forceful as interventionist as I think they ought to have been.
that's an interesting point, and we'll just come to the last question. Um, as a farmer advocating for farmer policies, I have seen that money allocated for agriculture research and development is like 0.2, less than 0.20% of the agriculture GDP. And if you look at even education, it's 4% of GDP, or you look at healthcare, it's 1.3% of GDP. Why do you think that people are not spending money or understanding the importance of human resources and in advancing the development of the country? Why do you think this investment is not coming in? And do you think it is because they find infrastructure projects more lucrative for corruption or of a siphoning of money?
No, I don't think it's the last. I think our political class is creative enough to make money from whatever. Uh, so I would not underestimate their creativity there. No, I think Hajay, you've hit the nail on the head. The biggest surplus that India has is its people, and the biggest failure that India has had is investing in its people, in their human capital. No, as you know, education is a state subject. Primary education, higher education is a concurrent subject. Name me a state besides, we think of Kerala in primary education, but not in higher education. Name me a state where you say, that state has really invested in human capital. Irrespective of ideology, the Congress was in power for decades. What did it do for primary education? The CPM was in power in Bengal for 30 years. What did it do? Right? It destroyed Bengal's universities. It didn't build them. The caste parties, when they came to power in UP, Bihar, you see what they did for education, not much. The Dravida parties in the south have done this a little more, especially on primary education. But higher education, again, it's political interference, indifference. Somehow, we simply have not gotten as a society more broadly, right? When do you see serious protests like the farmers' protests that have been going on, that their children have not been provided with adequate education or health? You never see that. So if people do not demand, politicians will not, they're not eager to supply that.
You're right. But I think so. Those are the things that matter most today is human resources. And that's where, as a farmers organization, we've been constantly saying, let's prioritize human resources over infrastructure. But that's
But
where
you
we
know
stand today.
that very few farmers movements have ever said we want the government to spend more on ag research and R&D. Instead, we have all this, well, you can't put research on GMOs. So it's always anti something. It's not for something. Whereas subsidies, everyone wants it.
So that's the paradox we have in India. Thank you so much, Professor Devesh Kapur, for taking time out and for giving these candid answers. We really appreciate it. The topic is very big. Hopefully, we'll return to you. We will take time from you and come back with new questions in the months to come. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ajay, like for having me.
Thank
Be
you.
safe.
Be safe.